Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. Part 1. Vengeance is mine, I will repay. Chapter 1. All happy families resemble one another. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. All was confusion in the house of the Oblonskys. The wife had discovered that her husband was having an intrigue with a French governess who had been in their employ, and she declared that she could not live in the same house with him. This condition of things had lasted now 3 days, and was causing deep discomfort, not only to the husband and wife, but also to all the members of the family and the domestics. All the members of the family and the domestics felt that there was no sense in their living together, and that in any hotel people meeting casually had more mutual interests than they, the members of the family and the domestics of the house of Oblonsky. The wife did not come out of her own rooms. The husband had not been at home for 2 days. The children were running over the whole house as if they were crazy. The English maid was angry with the housekeeper, and wrote to a friend begging her to find her a new place. The head cook had departed the evening before just at dinner time. The kitchen maid and the coachman demanded their wages. On the 3rd day after the quarrel, Prince Stefan Arkadyevitch Oblonsky, Stiva as he was called in society, awoke at the usual hour, that is to say about 8 o'clock in the morning, not in his wife's chamber, but in his library, on a leather-covered divan. He turned his portly pampered body on the springs of the divan as if intending to go to sleep again, and as he did so he threw his arm round the cushion and pressed his cheek to it. But suddenly he sat up and opened his eyes. Well, well, how was it? He mused, recalling a dream. Yes, how was it? Yes, Alabin was giving a dinner at Darmstadt. No, not at Darmstadt, but it was something American. Yes, but that Darmstadt was in America. Yes, Alabin was giving a dinner on glass tables. Yes, and the tables sang Il mio tesoro. No, not Il mio tesoro, but something better. And some little water bottles. They were women, said he, continuing his recollections. Prince Stefan's eyes flashed gaily, and he smiled as he said to himself, yes, it was very good, very good. There was something extremely elegant about it, but you can't tell it in words, and when you are awake you can't express the reality even in thought. Then, as he noticed a ray of sunlight which came in at the side of one of the heavy window curtains, he gaily set his feet down from the divan, found his gilt morocco slippers, they had been embroidered for him by his wife the year before as a birthday present, and, according to an old custom which he kept up for 9 years, he, without rising, stretched out his hand to the place where in his chamber hung his dressing-gown. And then he suddenly remembered how and why he had been sleeping, not in his wife's chamber, but in the library. The smile vanished from his face, and he frowned. Ugh, oh, ugh, oh, he groaned, as he recollected everything that had occurred, and before his mind arose once more all the details of the quarrel with his wife, all the hopelessness of his situation, and most lamentable of all, his own fault. No, she will not, and she cannot forgive me. And what is the worst of it, 'twas my own fault, and yet I am not to blame. In that lies all the tragedy of it, he said to himself. Ugh, 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 he kept muttering in his despair, as though over the exceedingly unpleasant consequences that would result to him from this quarrel. The most disagreeable moment was at the very first, when, as he came home from the theatre, happy and self-satisfied, bringing a monstrous pear for his wife, he did not find her in the sitting-room, nor, to his surprise, was she in the library. And at last he saw her in her chamber holding the fatal, all-revealing letter in her hand. She, Dolly, that forever busy and fussy and foolish creature as he always considered her, was sitting motionless with the note in her hand, and looked at him with an expression of terror, despair, and wrath. "What is this? This?" she demanded, pointing to the note. And as often happens, Stepan's torment at this recollection was caused less by the fact itself than by the answer which he gave to those words of his wife. His experience at that moment was the same as other people have had when unexpectedly detected in some shameful deed. He was unable to prepare his face for the situation caused by his wife's discovery of his sin. Instead of getting offended, denying it, justifying himself, asking forgiveness, or even showing indifference, anything would have been better than what he really did. In spite of himself, by a reflex action of the brain as Stepan Arkadyevitch explained it, for he loved physiology. Absolutely in spite of himself he suddenly smiled with his ordinary good-humored and therefore stupid smile. He could not forgive himself for that stupid smile. When Dolly saw that smile, she trembled as with physical pain, poured forth a torrent of bitter words, quite in accordance with her natural temper, and fled from the room. Since that time she had not been willing to see her husband. That stupid smile caused the whole trouble, thought Stepan Arkadyevitch. But what is to be done about it? What is to be done? He asked himself in despair, and found no answer. Stepan Arkadyevitch was a sincere man as far as he himself was concerned. He could not practice self-deception and persuade himself that he repented of his behavior. He could not, as yet, feel sorry that he, a handsome and susceptible man of 34, was not now in love with his wife, the mother of his 5 living and 2 buried children, though she was only a year his junior. He regretted only that he had not succeeded in hiding it better from her. But he felt the whole weight of his situation, and pitied his wife, his children, and himself. Possibly he would have had better success in hiding his peccadilloes from his wife had he realized that this knowledge would have had such an effect upon her. He had never before thought clearly of this question, but he had a dim idea that his wife had long been aware that he was not faithful to her, and looked at it through her fingers. As she had lost her freshness, was beginning to look old, was no longer pretty, and far from distinguished and entirely commonplace, though she was an excellent mother of a family, he had thought that she would allow her innate sense of justice to plead for him, but it had proved to be quite the contrary. "Ugh, how wretched! How wretched!" said Prince Stepan to himself over and over, and could not find any way out of the difficulty. And how well everything was going until this happened! How delightfully we lived! She was content, happy with the children. I never interfered with her in any way. I allowed her to do as she pleased with the children and the household. To be sure it was bad that she had been the governess in our own house. That was bad. There is something trivial and common in playing the gallant to one's own governess. But what a governess! He vividly recalled Mademoiselle Roland's black roguish eyes and her smile. But then, while she was here in the house with us, I did not permit myself any liberties. And the worst of all is that she is already... And this must needs happen just to spite me. Ai. But what is to be done? There was no answer except that common answer which life gives to all the most complicated and unsolvable questions. This answer: you must live according to circumstances. In other words, forget yourself. But as you cannot forget yourself in sleep, at least till night, as you cannot return to that music which the water-bottle woman sang, therefore you must forget yourself in the dream of life. "We shall see by and by," said Stepan Arkadyevitch to himself, and rising he put on his grey dressing-gown with blue silk lining, tied the tassels into a knot, and took a full breath into his ample lungs. Then with his usual firm step, his legs spread somewhat apart, and easily bearing the solid weight of his body, he went over to the window, lifted the curtain, and loudly rang the bell. It was instantly answered by his old friend and valet, Matvey, who came in bringing his clothes, boots, and a telegram. Behind Matvey came the barber with the shaving utensils. "Are there any papers from the courthouse?" asked Stepan Arkadyevitch, taking the telegram and taking his seat in front of the mirror. "On the breakfast table," replied Matvey, looking inquiringly and with sympathy at his master, and after an instant's pause, added with a sly smile, "They have come from the boss of the livery stable. Stepan Arkadyevitch made no reply, and only looked at Matvey in the mirror. By the look which they interchanged it could be seen how they understood each other. The look of Stepan Arkadyevitch seemed to ask, "Why did you say that? Don't you know?" Matvey thrust his hands in his jacket pockets, kicked out his leg, and silently, good-naturedly, almost smiling, looked back to his master. "I ordered them to come on Sunday, until then that you and I should not be annoyed without reason," said he, with a phrase evidently ready on his tongue. Stepan Arkadyevitch perceived that Matvey wanted to make some jesting reply and attract attention to himself. Tearing open the telegram, he read it, using his wits to make out the words, that were as usual blindly written, and his face brightened. "Matvey, Sister Anna Arkadyevna will be here tomorrow," said he, staying for a moment the plump gleaming hand of his barber, who was making a pink path through his long curly whiskers. "Thank God!" cried Matvey, showing by this exclamation that he understood as well as his master the significance of this arrival, that it meant that Anna Arkadyevna, Prince Stefan's loving sister, might effect a reconciliation between husband and wife. "Alone or with her husband?" asked Matvey. Stepan Arkadyevitch could not speak as the barber was engaged on his upper lip, but he lifted one finger. Matvey nodded his head toward the mirror. "Alone. Get her room ready." "Report to Darya Alexandrovna and let her decide." "To Darya Alexandrovna?" repeated Matvey, rather skeptically. "Yes, report to her. And here, take the telegram. Give it to her and do as she says." "You want to try an experiment," was the thought in Matvey's mind, but he only said, "I will obey." By this time Stepan Arkadyevitch had finished his bath and his toilet, and was just putting on his clothes, when Matvey, stepping slowly with squeaking boots, and with the telegram in his hand, returned to the room. The barber was no longer there. "Darya Alexandrovna bade me tell you she is going away. Do just as you please about it," said Matvey, with a smile lurking in his eyes. Thrusting his hands into his pockets, and bending his head to one side, he looked at his master. Stepan Arkadyevitch was silent. Then a good-humored and rather pitiful smile lighted up his handsome face. "Well, Matvey?" he said, shaking his head. "It is nothing, sir. She will come to her senses," answered Matvey. "Will come to her senses?" "Sure she will." "Do you think so? Who is there?" asked Stepan Arkadyevitch, hearing the rustle of a woman's dress behind the door. "It's me," said a powerful and pleasant female voice, and in the doorway appeared the severe and pimply face of Matryona Philimonovna, the nurse. "Well, what is it, Matriosha?" asked Stepan Arkadyevitch, going to meet her at the door. Notwithstanding the fact that Stepan Arkadyevitch was entirely in the wrong as regarded his wife, and he himself acknowledged it, still almost everyone in the house, even the old nurse, Darya Alexandrovna's chief friend, was on his side. "Well, what?" he asked gloomily. "You go down, sir. Ask her forgiveness, just once. Perhaps the Lord will bring it out right. She is tormenting herself grievously, and it is pitiful to see her. And everything in the house is going criss-cross. The children, sir, you must have pity on them. Ask her forgiveness, sir. What is to be done? No gains without pains." "But you see, she won't accept an apology." "But you do your part. God is merciful, sir. Pray to God. God is merciful." "Very well, then, come on," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, suddenly turning red in the face. "Very well, let me have my clothes," said he, turning to Matvey, and resolutely throwing off his dressing-gown. Matvey had everything all ready for him, and stood blowing off something invisible from the shirt stiff as a horse-collar, and with evident satisfaction he put it over his master's well-groomed body. Having dressed, Stepan Arkadyevitch sprinkled himself with perfume, straightened the sleeves of his shirt, according to his usual routine put into his various pockets cigarettes, his letter-case, matches, his watch with its double chain and locket, and shaking out his handkerchief, feeling clean, well-perfumed, healthy, and physically happy in spite of his unhappiness, he went out somewhat unsteadily into the dining-room, where his coffee was already waiting for him, and next the coffee his letters and the papers from the courthouse. He read the letters. One was very disagreeable, from a merchant who was negotiating for the purchase of a forest on his wife's estate. It was necessary to sell this forest, but now nothing could be done about it until a reconciliation was effected with his wife. Most unpleasant it was to think that his pecuniary interests in this approaching transaction were complicated with his reconciliation to his wife. And the thought that he might be influenced by this interest, that his desire for a reconciliation with his wife was on account of the sale of the forest, this thought mortified him. Having finished his letters, Stepan Arkadyevitch took up the papers from the courthouse, rapidly turned over the leaves of 2 deeds, made several notes with a big pencil, and then pushing them away, took his coffee. While he was drinking, he opened a morning journal still damp, and began to read. Stepan Arkadyevitch subscribed to a liberal paper, and read it. It was not extreme in its views, but advocated those principles which the majority held. And though he was not really interested in science, or art, or politics, he strongly adhered to such views on all these subjects as the majority, including his paper, advocated, and he changed them only when the majority changed them. Or more correctly, he did not change them, but they themselves imperceptibly changed in him. Stepan Arkadyevitch never chose principles or opinions, but these principles and opinions came to him, just as he never chose the shape of a hat or coat, but took those that others wore. And, living as he did in fashionable society, through the necessity of some mental activity, developing generally in a man's best years, it was as indispensable for him to have views as to have a hat. If there was any reason why he preferred liberal views rather than the conservative direction which many of his circle followed, it was not because he found a liberal tendency more rational, but because he found it better suited to his mode of life. The Liberal party declared that everything in Russia was wretched, and the fact was that Stepan Arkadyevitch had a good many debts and was decidedly short of money. The Liberal party said that marriage was a defunct institution and that it needed to be remodeled, and in fact domestic life afforded Stepan Arkadyevitch very little pleasure, and compelled him to lie and to pretend what was contrary to his nature. The Liberal party said, or rather took it for granted, that religion is only a curb on the barbarous portion of the community, and in fact Stepan Arkadyevitch could not bear the shortest prayer without pain in his knees, and he could not comprehend the necessity of all these awful and high-sounding words about the other world when it was so pleasant to live in this. Moreover, Stepan Arkadyevitch, who liked a merry jest, was sometimes fond of scandalizing a quiet man by saying that any one who was proud of his origin ought not to stop at Rurik and deny his earliest ancestor, the monkey. Thus the liberal tendency had become a habit with Stepan Arkadyevitch, and he liked his paper, just as he liked his cigar after dinner, because of the slight haziness which it caused in his brain. He was now reading the leading editorial, which proved that in our day a cry is raised, without reason, over the danger that radicalism may swallow up all the conservative elements, and that government ought to take measures to crush the hydra of revolution, and that, on the contrary, according to our opinion, the danger lies not in this imaginary hydra of revolution, but in the inertia of traditions which block progress, and so on. He read through another article on finance which made mention of Breton and Mill, and dropped some sharp hints for the ministry. With his peculiar quickness of comprehension he appreciated each point, from whom and against whom and on what occasion it was directed, and this as usual afforded him some amusement. But his satisfaction was poisoned by the remembrance of Matryona's advice and on the unfortunate state of his domestic affairs. He read also that Count von Buist was reported to have gone to Wiesbaden, and that there was to be no more grey hair. He read about the sale of a light carriage and a young woman's advertisement for a place, but these items did not afford him quiet, ironical satisfaction as usual. Having finished his paper, his second cup of coffee, and a buttered roll, he stood up, shook the crumbs of the roll from his waistcoat, and, filling his broad chest, smiled joyfully, not because there was anything extraordinarily pleasant in his mind, but the joyful smile was caused by good digestion. But this joyful smile immediately brought back the memory of everything, and he sank into thought. The voices of 2 children, Stepan Arkadyevitch knew they were Grisha, his youngest boy, and Tanya, his eldest daughter, were now heard behind the door. They were dragging something and upset it. "I told you not to put the passengers on top," cried the little girl in English. "Now pick them up." "Everything is in confusion," said Stepan Arkadyevitch to himself. "Now here the children are, running wild." And going to the door he called them. They dropped the little box which served them for a railway train and ran to their father. The little girl, her father's favorite, ran in boldly, threw her arms around his neck, and laughingly hugged him, enjoying as usual the odor which exhaled from his whiskers. Then, kissing his face, reddened by his bending position and beaming with tenderness, the little girl unclasped her hands and wanted to run away again, but her father held her back. "What is mamma doing?" he asked, caressing his daughter's smooth, soft neck. "How are you?" he added, smiling at the boy who stood saluting him. He acknowledged he had less love for the little boy, yet he tried to be impartial. But the boy felt the difference, and did not smile back in reply to his father's chilling smile. "Mamma, she's up," answered the little girl. Stepan Arkadyevitch sighed. "Of course she has spent another sleepless night," he said to himself. "Well, is she cheerful?" The little girl knew that there was trouble between her father and her mother, and that her mother could not be cheerful, and that her father ought to know it, and that he was dissembling when he questioned her so lightly. And she blushed for her father. He instantly perceived it, and also turned red. "I don't know," she said. "She told me that we were not to have lessons this morning, but were to go with Miss Hull over to grandmother's." "Well, then, run along, Tranchurachka moya. Oh, yes, wait," he said, still detaining her and smoothing her delicate little hand. He took down from the mantelpiece a box of candy which he had placed there the day before, and gave her 2 pieces, selecting her favorite chocolate and vanilla. "For Grisha?" she asked, pointing to the chocolate. "Yes, yes." And still smoothing her soft shoulder, he kissed her on the neck and hair and let her go. "The carriage is at the door," said Matvey, and he added, "A woman is here, a petitioner." "Has she been here long?" demanded Stepan Arkadyevitch. "Half an hour." "How many times have you been told to announce visitors instantly?" "I had to get your coffee ready," replied Matvey, in his kind, rough voice, at which it was impossible to take offense. "Well, show her in quick," said Oblonsky, frowning with annoyance. The petitioner, the wife of Captain Karenin, asked some impossible and nonsensical favor, but Stepan Arkadyevitch, according to his custom, gave her a comfortable seat, listened to her story without interrupting, and then gave her cheerful advice to whom and how to make her application, and in lively and eloquent style wrote, in his big, scrawling, but handsome and legible hand, a note to the person who might aid her. Having dismissed the captain's wife, Stepan Arkadyevitch took his hat and stood for a moment trying to remember whether he had forgotten anything. He seemed to have forgotten nothing except what he wanted to forget, his wife. Ah, yes. He dropped his head, and a gloomy expression came over his handsome face. To go or not to go, he said to himself, and an inner voice told him that it was not advisable to go, that there was no way out of it except through deception, that to straighten, to smooth out, their relations was impossible, because it was impossible to make her attractive and lovable again, or to make him an old man insensible to passion. Nothing but deception and lying could come of it, and deception and lying were opposed to his nature. "But it must be done sometime. It can't remain so always," said he, striving to gain courage. He straightened himself, took out a cigarette, lighted it, puffed at it 2 or 3 times, threw it into a mother-of-pearl lined ash-tray, went with quick steps through the sitting-room, and opened the door into his wife's sleeping-room. Darya Alexandrovna, surrounded by all sorts of things thrown in confusion about the room, was standing before an open chiffonier, from which she was removing the contents. She had on a dressing sack, and the thin braids of her once luxuriant and beautiful hair were pinned back. Her face was thin and sunken, and her big eyes, protruding from her pale, worn face, had an expression of terror. When she heard her husband's steps, she stopped in her work and, gazing at the door, vainly tried to give her face a stern and forbidding expression. She was conscious that she feared him and that she dreaded the coming interview. She was in the act of doing what she had attempted to do a dozen times during those 3 days, gathering up her own effects and those of her children to carry to her mother's house, and again she could not bring herself to do it. Yet now, as before, she said to herself that things could not remain as they were, that she must take some measure to punish him, to put him to shame, to have some revenge on him, if only for a small part of the anguish that he had caused her. She still kept saying that she should leave him, but she felt that it was impossible. It was impossible because she could not cease to consider him her husband and to love him. Moreover, she confessed that if here in her own home she had barely succeeded in looking after her 5 children, it would be far worse where she was going with them. In the course of these 3 days the youngest child had been made ill by eating some poor soup, and the rest had been obliged to go almost dinnerless the night before. She felt that it was impossible to leave, yet for the sake of deceiving herself she was collecting her things and pretending that she was going. When she saw her husband, she thrust her hands into a drawer of the chiffonier, as if trying to find something, and looked at him only when he came up close to her. But her face, to which she had intended to give a stern and resolute expression, showed her confusion and anguish of mind. "Dolly," said he, in a gentle, subdued voice. He hung his head and tried to assume a humble and submissive mien, but nevertheless he was radiant with fresh life and health. She gave him a quick glance which took in his whole figure from head to foot, radiant with life and health. "Yes, he is happy and contented," she said to herself, "but and this good nature which makes everybody like him so well, and praise him, is revolting to me. I hate this good nature of his." Her mouth grew firm, and the muscles of her right cheek contracted. She looked pale and nervous. "What do you want?" she demanded, in a quick, unnatural tone. "Dolly," he repeated, with a quaver in his voice. "Anna is coming to-day." "Well, what is that to me? I cannot receive her," she cried. "Still, it must be done, Dolly." "Go away! Go away! Go away!" she cried, without looking at him, as if her words were torn from her by physical agony. Stepan Arkadyevitch might be calm enough as his thoughts turned to his wife. He might have some hope that it would all straighten itself out according to Matva's prediction, and he might be able tranquilly to read his morning paper and drink his coffee. But when he saw her tortured, suffering face, when he heard that resigned and hopeless tone of her voice, he breathed hard, something rose in his throat, and his eyes filled with tears. "My God, what have I done? For God's sake, see—" He could not say another word for the sobs that choked him. She shut the drawer violently and looked at him. "Dolly, what can I say? Only one thing. Forgive me. Just think. Cannot 9 years of my life pay for a single moment? A moment—" She let her eyes fall, and listened to what he was going to say, as if beseeching him in some way to persuade her of his innocence. "A single moment of temptation," he ended, and was going to continue, but at that word Dolly's lips again closed tight, as if from physical pain, and again the muscles of her right cheek contracted. Go away from here," she cried still more impetuously, "and don't speak to me of your temptations and your wretched conduct." She attempted to leave the room, but she almost fell, and was obliged to lean upon a chair for support. Oblonsky's face grew melancholy, his lips trembled, and his eyes filled with tears. "Dolly," said he, almost sobbing, "for God's sake think of the children. They are not to blame. I am the one to blame. Punish me. Tell me how I can atone for my fault. I am ready to do anything. I am guilty. No words can tell how guilty I am. But, Dolly, forgive me." She sat down. He heard her quick, hard breathing, and his soul was filled with pity for her. She tried several times to speak, but could not utter a word. He waited. "You think of the children, because you like to play with them. But I think of them too, and I know what they have lost," said she, repeating one of the phrases that during the last 3 days she had many times repeated to herself. She had used the familiar "tu," thou, and he looked at her with gratitude and made a movement as if to take her hand, but she turned away from him with abhorrence. "I have consideration for my children, and therefore I would do all in the world to save them. But I do not myself know how I can best save them, by taking them from their father, or by leaving them with a father who is a libertine. Yes, a libertine. Now tell me after this has happened, can we live together? Is it possible? Tell me, is it possible?" she demanded, raising her voice. "When my husband, the father of my children, has a love affair with their governess?" "But what is to be done about it? What is to be done?" said he, interrupting with broken voice, not knowing what he said, and letting his head sink lower and lower. "You are revolting to me. You are insulting," she cried with increasing anger. "Your tears are water. You never loved me. You have no heart, no honor. You are abominable, revolting, and henceforth you are a stranger to me. Yes, a perfect stranger." And she repeated with spiteful anger this word stranger, which was so terrible in her own ears. He looked at her, and the anger expressed in her face alarmed and surprised him. He had no realizing sense that his pity exasperated his wife. He saw that he felt sympathy for her, but not love. "No, she hates me. She will not forgive me," he said to himself. "This is terrible, terrible!" he cried. At this moment one of the children in the next room, having apparently had a fall, began to cry. Darya Alexandrovna listened, and her face suddenly softened. She seemed to collect her thoughts for a few seconds, as if she did not know where she was and what was happening to her. Then, quickly rising, she hastened to the door. "At any rate she loves my child," thought Oblonsky, who had noticed the change in her face as she heard the little ones cry. "My child! How then can she hate me? Dolly, just one word more," he said, following her. "If you follow me I will call the domestics, the children. Let them all know that you are infamous. I leave you this very day, and you may live here with your paramour." And she went out and slammed the door. Stepan Arkadyevitch sighed, wiped his face, and softly left the room. "Matvey says this can be settled, but how? I don't see the possibility. Oh, how terrible, and how foolishly she shrieked," said he to himself as he recalled her cry and the words infamous and paramour. "Perhaps the chambermaids heard her. Horribly foolish, horribly." Stepan Arkadyevitch stood by himself a few seconds, rubbed his eyes, sighed, and then, throwing out his chest, left the room. It was Friday, and in the dining room the German clockmaker was winding the clock. Stepan Arkadyevitch remembered a joke that he had made about this punctilious German clockmaker, to the effect that he must have been wound up himself for a lifetime for the purpose of winding clocks, and he smiled. Stepan Arkadyevitch loved a good joke. "Perhaps it will straighten itself out. That's a good little phrase. Straighten itself out," he thought. "I must tell that." "Matvey!" he shouted, and when the old servant appeared he said, "Have Marya put the best room in order for Anna Arkadyevna." "Very well." Stepan Arkadyevitch took his fur coat and started down the steps. "Shall you dine at home?" asked Matvey, as he escorted him down. "That depends. Here, take this if you need to spend anything," said he, taking out a bill of 10 rubles from his pocket-book. "That will be enough." "Whether it is enough or not, it will have to do," said Matvey, as he shut the carriage door and went up the steps. Meantime Darya Alexandrovna, having pacified the child, and knowing by the sound of the carriage that he was gone, came back to her room. This was her sole refuge from the domestic troubles that besieged her as soon as she went out. Even during the short time that she had been in the nursery, the English maid and Matryona Philimonovna asked her all sorts of questions demanding immediate attention, questions which she alone could answer. What clothes should they put on the children for their walk, and should they give them milk? Should they send for another cook? "Ugh, Leave me alone! Leave me alone!" she cried, and, hastening back to the chamber, she sat down in the place where she had been talking with her husband. Then clasping her thin hands, on whose fingers the rings would scarcely stay, she reviewed the whole conversation. "He has gone, but has he broken with her?" she asked herself. "Does he still continue to see her? Why didn't I ask him? No, no, we cannot live together, even if we continue to live in the same house. We are only strangers, strangers forever," she repeated with a strong emphasis on the word that hurt her so cruelly. "How I loved him! And even now, do I not love him? Do I not love him even more than before? That is the most terrible thing," she was beginning to say, but she did not finish out her thought, because Matryona Philimonovna put her head in at the door. "Give orders to send for my brother," said she. "He will get dinner. If you don't, it will be like yesterday, when the children did not have anything to eat for 6 hours." "Very good. I will come and give the order. Have you sent for some fresh milk?" And Darya Alexandrovna entered into her daily tasks, and in them forgot her sorrow for the time being. Stepan Arkadyevitch had done well at school, by reason of his excellent natural gifts, but he was lazy and mischievous, and consequently had been at the foot of his class. But, in spite of his irregular habits, his low rank in the service, and his youth, he, nevertheless, held an important salaried position as nachalnik, or president of one of the courts in Moscow. This place he had secured through the good offices of his sister Anna's husband, Alexey Alexandrovitch Karenin, who occupied one of the most influential positions in the ministry of which he was a member. But even if Karenin had not been able to get this place for his brother-in-law, 100 other people, brothers, sisters, cousins, second cousins, uncles, aunts, would have got it for Stiva Oblonsky, or some place as good, together with the 6,000 rubles salary which he needed for his establishment, his affairs being somewhat out of order in spite of his wife's considerable fortune. Half the people of Moscow and St. Petersburg were relatives or friends of Stepan Arkadyevitch. He was born into the society of the rich and powerful of this world. A third of the older officials attached to the court and in the government employ had been friends of his father, and had known him from the time when he wore petticoats. A second third addressed him familiarly in the second person singular. The others were "hail fellows well met." He had, therefore, as his friends, all those whose function it is to dispense earthly blessings in the shape of places, leases, concessions, and the like, and who could not neglect their own. And so Oblonsky had no special difficulty in obtaining an excellent place. All he had to do was not to shirk, not to be jealous, not to be quarrelsome, not to be thin-skinned, and he never gave way to these faults, because of his natural good temper. It would have seemed ridiculous to him if he had been told that he could not have any salaried place that he wanted, because it did not seem to him that he demanded anything extraordinary. He asked only for what his companions were obtaining, and he felt that he was as capable as any of them of performing the duties of such a position. Stepan Arkadyevitch was liked by everyone for his good and amiable character, and his unimpeachable honesty. There was, moreover, something in his brilliant and attractive personality, in his bright, sparkling eyes, his black brows, his hair, his vivid coloring, which exercised a strong physical influence as a friendliness and gaiety on those who came in touch with him. "Ah, Stiva, Oblonsky, here he is," people would generally say with a smile of pleasure. Even if it happened that the results of meeting him were not particularly gratifying, nevertheless people were just as glad to meet him the second day and the third. After filling for 3 years the office of nachalnik of one of the chief judiciary positions in Moscow, Stepan Arkadyevitch had gained not only the friendship but also the respect of his colleagues, both those above and those below him in station, as well as of all who had dealings with him. The principal qualities that had gained him this universal esteem were, first, his extreme indulgence for people, and this was founded on his knowledge of his own weaknesses. Secondly, his absolute liberality, which was not the liberalism which he read about in the newspapers, but that which was in his blood, and caused him to be agreeable to everyone, and in whatever station in life. And thirdly, and principally, his perfect indifference to the business which he transacted, so that he never lost his temper, and therefore never made mistakes. As soon as he reached his tribunal, Stepan Arkadyevitch, escorted by the solemn Swiss who bore his portfolio, went to his little private office, put on his uniform, and proceeded to the courtroom. The clerks and other employees all stood up, bowing eagerly and respectfully. Stepan Arkadyevitch, as usual, hastened to his place, shook hands with his colleagues, and took his seat. He got off some pleasantry and made some remark suitable to the occasion, and then opened the session. No one better than he understood how far to go within the limits of freedom, frankness, and that official dignity which is so useful in the expression of official business. A clerk came with papers and, with the free and yet respectful air common to all who surrounded Stepan Arkadyevitch, spoke in the familiarly liberal tone which Stepan Arkadyevitch had introduced. "We have at last succeeded in obtaining reports to the government of Penza. Here they are, if you care to—" "So we have them at last," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, touching the document with his finger. "Now, then, gentlemen," and the proceedings began. "If they knew," he said to himself as he bent his head with an air of importance while the report was read, "how much their president, only half an hour since, looked like a naughty schoolboy," and a gleam of amusement came into his eyes as he listened to the report. The session generally lasted till 2 o'clock without interruption, and was followed by recess and luncheon. The clock had not yet struck 2 when the great glass doors of the courtroom were suddenly thrown open, and some one entered. All the members, glad of any diversion, looked round from where they sat under the emperor's portrait, and behind the zertzalo, or proclamation table, but the doorkeeper instantly ejected the intruder, and shut the door on him. After the business was read through, Stepan Arkadyevitch arose, stretched himself, and in spite of sacrifice to the liberalism of the time, took out his cigarette, while still in the courtroom, and then passed into his private office. Two of his colleagues, the aged veteran Nikitin and the chamberlain Grinovitch, followed him. "There'll be time enough to finish after luncheon," said Oblonsky. "How we are rushing through with it," replied Nikitin. "This Feynman must be a precious rascal," said Grinovitch, alluding to one of the characters in the affair which they had been investigating. Stepan Arkadyevitch knitted his brows at Grinovitch's words, as if to signify that it was not the right thing to form snap judgments, and he made no reply. "Who was it came into the courtroom?" he asked of the doorkeeper. "Some one who entered without permission, your excellency, while my back was turned. He asked to see you. I said, when the court adjourns, then—" "Where is he?" "Probably in the vestibule. He was there just now. Ah, there he is," said the doorkeeper, pointing to a solidly built, broad-shouldered man with a curly beard who, without taking off his sheepskin cap, was lightly and quickly running up the well-worn steps of the stone staircase. A lean chinovnik, on his way down, with a portfolio under his arm, stopped to look, with some indignation, at the newcomer's feet, and turned to Oblonsky with a glance of inquiry. Stepan Arkadyevitch stood at the top of the staircase, and his bright, good-natured face set off by the embroidered collar of his uniform was still more radiant when he recognized the visitor. "Here he is, Levin at last!" he cried with a friendly, ironical smile as he looked at his approaching friend. "What, you got tired of waiting for me, and have come to find me in this den?" he went on to say, not satisfied with pressing his hand, but kissing him affectionately. "Have you been in town long?" "I just got here, and was in a hurry to see you," said Levin, looking about him timidly, and at the same time with a fierce and anxious expression. "Well, come into my office," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, who was aware of his visitor's egotistic sensitiveness, and, taking him by the hand, led him along as if he were conducting him through manifold dangers. Stepan Arkadyevitch addressed almost all his acquaintances with the familiar thou, old men of 60, young men of 20, actors and ministers, merchants and generals, so that there were very many of these familiarly addressed acquaintances from both extremes of the social scale, and they would have been astonished to know that through Oblonsky they had something in common. He thus addressed all with whom he had drunk champagne, and he had drunk champagne with everyone, and so when in the presence of his subordinates he met with any of his shameful intimates, as he jestingly called some of his acquaintances, His characteristic tact was sufficient to diminish the disagreeable impressions that they might have. Levin was not one of his shameful intimates, but Oblonsky instinctively felt that Levin might think he would not like to make a display of their intimacy before his subordinates, and so he hastened to take him into his private office. Levin was about the same age as Oblonsky, and their intimacy was not based on champagne alone. Levin was a friend and companion from early boyhood. In spite of the difference in their characters and their tastes, they were fond of each other as friends are who have grown up together. And yet, as often happens among men who have chosen different spheres of activity, each, while approving the work of the other, really despised it. Each believed his own mode of life to be the only rational way of living, while that led by his friend was only an illusion. At the sight of Levin, Oblonsky could not repress a slight ironical smile. How many times had he seen him in Moscow just in from the country, where he had been doing something, though Oblonsky did not know exactly what, and scarcely took any interest in it. Levin always came to Moscow anxious, hurried, a trifle annoyed, and vexed because he was annoyed, and generally bringing with him entirely new and unexpected views of things. Stepan Arkadyevitch laughed at this, and yet liked it. In somewhat the same way Levin despised the city mode of his friend's life, and his official employment, which he considered trifling, and made sport of it. But the difference between them lay in this, that Oblonsky, doing what everyone else was doing, laughed self-confidently and good-naturedly, while Levin, because he was not assured in his own mind, sometimes lost his temper. "We have been expecting you for some time," said Stepan Arkadyevitch as he entered his office and let go his friend's hand to show that the danger was past. "I am very, very glad to see you," he continued. "How goes it? How are you? When did you come?" Levin was silent and looked at the unknown faces of Oblonsky's two colleagues, and especially at the elegant Granovich's hand, with its long white fingers and their long yellow and pointed nails, and his cuffs with their huge gleaming cuff buttons. It was evident that his hands absorbed all of his attention and allowed him to think of nothing else. Oblonsky instantly noticed this and smiled. "Ah, yes," he said. "Allow me to make you acquainted with my colleagues. Philip Ivanovitch Nikitin, Mikhail Stanislavitch Granovitch." Then turning to Levin, "A landed proprietor, a rising man, a member of the Zemstvo, and a gymnast who can lift 200 pounds with one hand, a raiser of cattle, and huntsman, and my friend, Konstantin Dmitrievitch Levin, the brother of Sergei Ivanovitch Koznuishev." "Very happy," said the little old man. "I have the honor of knowing your brother, Sergei Ivanovitch," said Granovitch, extending his delicate hand with its long nails. Levin frowned. He coldly shook hands and turned to Oblonsky. Although he had much respect for his half-brother, a writer universally known in Russia, it was none the less unpleasant for him to be addressed not as Konstantin Levin, but as the brother of the famous Koznuishev. "No, I am no longer a worker in the Zemstvo. I have quarreled with everybody, and I don't go to the assemblies," said he to Oblonsky. "This is a sudden change," said Stepan Arkadyevitch with a smile. "But how? Why?" "It is a long story, and I will tell it some other time," replied Levin, but he nevertheless went on to say, "To make a long story short, I was convinced that no action amounts to anything, or can amount to anything, in our provincial assemblies." He spoke as if some one had insulted him. "On the one hand, they try to play parliament, and I am not young enough and not old enough to amuse myself with toys. And on the other hand," he hesitated, "this serves the district ring to make a little money. There used to be guardianships, judgments, but now they have the Zemstvo, not in the way of bribes, but in the way of unearned salaries." He spoke hotly, as if some one present had attacked his views. "Aha! Here you are, I see, in a new phrase, on the conservative side," said Stepan Arkadyevitch. "Well, we'll speak about this by and by." "Yes, by and by. But I want to see you particularly," said Levin, looking with disgust at Granovich's hand. Stepan Arkadyevitch smiled imperceptibly. "Didn't you say that you would never again put on European clothes?" he asked, examining his friend's new suit, evidently made by a French tailor. "Indeed I see. 'Tis a new phase." Levin suddenly grew red, not as grown men grow red, without perceiving it, but as boys blush, conscious that they are ridiculous by reason of their bashfulness, and therefore ashamed and made to turn still redder till the tears almost come. It gave his intelligent, manly face such a strange appearance that Oblonsky turned away and refrained from looking at him. "But where can we meet? You see it is very, very necessary for me to have a talk with you," said Levin. Oblonsky seemed to reflect. "How is this? We will go and have luncheon at Gurin's, and we can talk there. At 3 o'clock I shall be free." "No," answered Levin after a moment's thought. "I've got to take a drive." "Well then, let us dine together." "Dine? But I have nothing very particular to say. Only 2 words, to ask a question. Afterward we can gossip." "In that case speak your 2 words now. We will chat while we are at dinner." "These 2 words are... However, it is nothing very important." His face suddenly assumed a hard expression due to his efforts in conquering his timidity. "What are the Shtcherbatskys doing? Just as they used to?" Stepan Arkadyevitch, who had long known that Levin was in love with his sister-in-law Kitty, almost perceptibly smiled, and his eyes flashed gaily. "You said 2 words, but I cannot answer in 2 words because... Excuse me a moment." The secretary came in at this juncture with his familiar but respectful bearing, and with that modest assumption characteristic of all secretaries that he knew more about business than his superior. He brought some papers to Oblonsky, and under the form of a question he attempted to explain some difficulty. Without waiting to hear the end of the explanation, Stepan Arkadyevitch laid his hand affectionately on the secretary's arm. "No, do as I asked you to," said he, tempering his remark with a smile, and, having briefly given his own explanation of the matter, he pushed away the papers and said, "Do it so, I beg of you, Zakhar Nikititch." The secretary went off confused. Levin during this scene with the secretary had entirely recovered from his embarrassment, and was standing with both arms resting on a chair. On his face was an ironical expression. I don't understand, said he. "What don't you understand?" asked Oblonsky, smiling and taking out a cigarette. He was expecting some sort of strange outbreak from Levin. "I don't understand what you are up to," said Levin, shrugging his shoulders. "How can you do this sort of thing seriously?" "Why not?" "Why, because it is doing nothing." "You think so? We are overwhelmed with work." "On paper? Well, yes, you have a special gift for such things," added Levin. "You mean that there is something that I lack?" "Perhaps so, yes. However, I cannot help admiring your high and mighty ways, and rejoicing that I have for a friend a man of such importance. But you did not answer my question," he asked, making a desperate effort to look Oblonsky full in the face. "Now that's very good, very good. Go ahead, and you will succeed. 'Tis well that you have 8,000 acres of land in the district of Karazinsk. Such muscles and the complexion of a little girl of 12. But you will catch up with us all the same. Yes, as to what you asked me, there is no change, but I am sorry that it has been so long since you were in town." "Why?" asked Levin in alarm. "Well, it's nothing," replied Oblonsky. "We will talk things over. What has brought you now especially?" "Ah, we will speak also of that by and by," said Levin, again reddening to his very ears. "Very good. I understand you," said Stepan Arkadyevitch. "You see, I should have taken you home with me to dinner, but my wife is not well today. If you want to see them, you will find them at the Zoological Gardens from 4 to 5. Kitty is skating. You go there. I will join you later, and we will get dinner somewhere together." "Excellent. Das Vidanya." "Look here. You see I do know you. You will forget all about it, or will be suddenly starting back to your home in the country," cried Stepan Arkadyevitch with a laugh. "No, truly I won't." Levin left the room, and only when he had passed the door realized that he had forgotten to salute Oblonsky's colleagues. "That must be a gentleman of great energy," said Grinevitch, after Levin had taken his departure. "Yes, Batyushka," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, throwing his head back. "He is a likely fellow. 8,000 acres in the Karazinsky district. He has a future before him, and how vigorous he is! He is not like the rest of us." "What have you to complain about, Stepan Arkadyevitch?" "Well, things are bad." "Bad," replied Stepan Arkadyevitch, sighing heavily. When Oblonsky asked Levin for what special reason he had come, Levin grew red in the face, and he was angry with himself because he grew red. But how could he have replied, "I have come to ask the hand of your sister-in-law"? Yet he had come for that single purpose. The Levin and the Shtcherbatsky families, belonging to the old nobility of Moscow, had always been on intimate and friendly terms. During Levin's student life the bond had grown stronger. He and the young Prince Shtcherbatsky, the brother of Dolly and Kitty, had taken their preparatory studies and gone through the university together. At that time Levin was a frequent visitor at the Shtcherbatskys and was in love with the house. Strange as it may seem, he was in love with the house itself, with the family, especially with the feminine portion. Konstantin Levin could not remember his mother, and his only sister was much older than he was, so that for the first time he found in the house of the Shtcherbatskys that charming and cultivated life so peculiar to the old nobility, and of which the death of his parents had deprived him. All the members of this family, but especially the ladies, seemed to him to be surrounded with a mysterious and poetic halo. Not only did he fail to discover any faults in them, but underneath this poetic and mysterious halo surrounding them, he saw the loftiest sentiments and the most ideal perfections. Why these three young ladies were obliged to speak French and English every day, why they had to take turns in playing for hours at a time on the piano, the sounds of which floated up to their brother's room, where the young students were at work, why professors of French literature, of music, of drawing, of dancing, had come to give them lessons, why the three young ladies, at a certain hour, accompanied by Mademoiselle Linon, drove out in their carriage to the Tverskoye Boulevard, wearing satin shubkas, Dolly's very long, Natalie's of half length, and Kitty's very short, showing her shapely ankles and close-fitting red stockings, and why when they went to the Tverskoye Boulevard they had to be accompanied by a lackey with a gilt cockade on his hat. All these things and many others were absolutely incomprehensible to him. But he felt that all that took place in this mysterious sphere was beautiful, and he was in love especially with this mystery of accomplishment. While he was a student he almost fell in love with Dolly, the eldest, but she soon married Oblonsky. Then he began to be in love with the second. It was as if he felt it to be a necessity to love one of the three, only he could not decide which one he liked the best. But Natalie entered society and soon married the diplomat, Lvov. Kitty was only a child when Levin left the university. Young Shtcherbatsky joined the fleet and was drowned in the Baltic, and Levin's relations with the family became more distant in spite of his friendship with Oblonsky. At the beginning of the winter, however, after a year's absence in the country, he had met the Shtcherbatskys again, and learned for the first time which of the three he was destined really to love. It would seem as if there could be nothing simpler for a young man of 32, of good family, possessed of a fair fortune, and likely to be regarded as an eligible suitor, than to ask the young Princess Shtcherbatskaya in marriage, and probably Levin would have been accepted as an excellent match. But he was in love, and consequently it seemed to him Kitty was a creature so accomplished, her superiority was so above everything earthly, and he himself was such an earthly insignificant being, that he was unwilling to admit, even in thought, that others, or Kitty herself, would regard him as worthy of her. Having spent 2 months in Moscow, as in a dream, meeting Kitty almost every day in society, which he allowed himself to frequent on account of her, he suddenly concluded that this alliance was impossible, and took his departure for the country. Levin's conclusion that it was impossible was reached by reasoning that in her parents' eyes he was not a suitor sufficiently advantageous or suitable for the beautiful Kitty, and that Kitty herself could not love him. In her parents' eyes he was engaged in no definite line of activity, and at his age had no position in the world, while his comrades were colonels or staff officers, distinguished professors, bank directors, railway officials, presidents of tribunals like Oblonsky. But he, and he knew very well how he was regarded by his friends, was only a pomeshchik, or country proprietor, busy with breeding of cows, hunting woodcock, and building farmhouses. In other words, he was an incapable youth who had accomplished nothing, and who, in the eyes of society, was doing just what men do who have made a failure. Surely, the mysterious, charming Kitty could not love a man so ill-favoured, dull, and good-for-nothing as he felt that he was. Moreover, his former relations with her, consequent upon his friendship with her brother, were those of a grown man with a child, and seemed to him only an additional obstacle to love. It was possible, he thought, for a girl to have a friendship for a good, homely man, such as he considered himself to be. But if he is to be loved with a love such as he felt for Kitty, he must be good-looking, and above all, a man of distinction. He had heard that women often fall in love with ill-favoured, stupid men, but he did not believe that such would be his own experience, just as he felt that it would be impossible for him to love a woman who was not beautiful, brilliant, and poetic. But, having spent 2 months in the solitude of the country, he became convinced that this was not one of his youthful passions, that the state of his feelings allowed him not a moment of rest, and that he could not live without settling this mighty question, whether she would or would not be his wife, that his despair arose wholly from his imagination, and that he had no absolute certainty that she would refuse him. He had now returned to Moscow with the firm intention of offering himself and of marrying her if she would accept him. If not, he could not think what would become of him.